So my grandfather, Jim, died when I was 17, around 5 years ago, and his last months were rough on the whole family. He had advanced brain cancer, but he spent most of his time at home under hospice care. One afternoon, it was about 2 weeks before he died, I was alone with my grandpa waiting for the hospice nurse to come check on him. A man who I'd never seen before, Dave, knocked on the door, and he was wearing hospital scrubs, but he hadn't brought any equipment with him, which was odd. I asked him if he worked for the hospital, and he nodded. He said that this was the first shift with Jim that he'd had, but that he'd reviewed my grandfather's file, and that he wanted to speak to whichever family member had the legal authority to pull the plug. Jim wasn't even on life support, so I guess Dave was using plug as an expression of my grandfather. I should say that I live in a right-to-die state where euthanasia is legal, so it's not like that option had never occurred to us, but as far as I know, no member of my family had ever expressed an openness to euthanize Jim. I told him that I had no authority to make that decision, and that my grandfather, who was now delirious and unable to consent to much of anything, had specifically said to prolong his life indefinitely unless he was crying out in extreme pain, which he wasn't. Dave put his hand on my shoulder as though he were consoling me, and he talked about how old people become burdens, that their families need to let go of them. Then Dave pulled a bottle of pills out of his pocket and said they were barbiturates that would trigger a peaceful death. He said the coroner would determine that Jim died naturally from his cancer. At that, I started to panic, and I firmly told him that under no circumstances would he be euthanizing Jim at this time. But he started to untwist the bottle as he walked toward Jim's bed. I tried to wrestle the pills from his hand. He seemed startled. He played innocent and said that he just wanted to show the pills to Jim. Dave knew perfectly well that my grandfather had almost no idea what was going on, though. So I called 911 and rapidly explained the situation to the dispatcher. Dave suddenly became very scared and then bolted out of the house. The cops arrived within 5 minutes, and Jim's actual hospice nurse arrived a few minutes after that too. Based on my physical description, the police hospital staff were able to identify Dave as a recently fired hospital orderly. Dave was charged with making a criminal threat based on my testimony, but unfortunately, he was acquitted. So this was the creepiest and most unusual thing that has ever happened to me, and I still think about it from time to time, and I wanted to share it. So I travel pretty often for business. Usually it's San Jose, and I'll stay there for a couple of weeks. I'm usually working long hours, so by the time that I get to the hotel, I have a routine down pretty good. I get to the room late. I usually just strip down next to the bed and climb in. Maybe watch some Netflix on my tablet, and then pretty much just fall asleep. The next morning, I'll wake up, pick up my clothes and stuff them into my dirty clothes bag, hit the bathroom, then take a shower. I'll brush my teeth, comb my hair, get dressed, and leave for the day. When I pick up my clothes, I always make sure that I grab everything too. And one morning, after I had been staying at the hotel for about 10 days, I went to grab my clothes and I noticed that I only had one sock. I looked under the bed and it wasn't there. I thought that maybe I might have had it on when I got into bed, so I stripped the sheets looking for it. Not there either. I looked under every piece of furniture and just couldn't find it. I even emptied out my dirty clothes bag and counted the socks that were in there, but I still had an odd number of dirty socks. I checked the pant legs to see if it was in there, but nothing. I must have spent a good 30 minutes looking around the room for this damn sock. I even checked the garbage can. Finally, in the end, I just sort of gave up and started getting ready for work. I went into the bathroom and opened the shower to start the water running. And sitting right there in the middle of the tub was my missing sock. The shower was enclosed in glass, with just a narrow gap near the ceiling about 3 inches high. I hadn't been into the bathroom since the morning before when I showered and got dressed. And to this day, I still have no idea how my sock ended up in there. I mean, it makes 0 sense. I don't know if I might have been sleepwalking, which I never do, or if a rat or something grabbed it and carried it in there, or if someone came into my room while I was sleeping and moved the sock for some reason, or if it was a ghost. I'll never know, I guess, but man, it still freaks me out to this day. When I found that sock, I almost had a heart attack. We moved into our first home in February of 2016. It was an old home, built in the early 1900s, in the historic part of town. But I loved it. All of the hand-carved woodwork and glass doorknobs and skeleton locks. It was exactly what I wanted, and perfect for myself, 22-year-old female at the time, and my husband, 27 male at the time. I was 3 months pregnant with our first, and we were so excited to start our family. As we got settled in, we noticed the house was very noisy though. I rarely have my home quiet due to having tinnitus and always needing some kind of background noise to drown it out. On the rare occasion the house was quiet, there was always lots of creaking and moving, mostly coming from the loft-style attic that we had. But we shook it off as the house just settling and being old. At least, that was what my dad told us. So we moved on. Spring came and we were scrambling to get ready for the baby. The house needed a lot of work, but we were determined to get it done. The first major encounter, though, was on a beautiful spring day. It was the weekend, and my husband and I were spending our day off working on the house. I was cleaning the kitchen, and he was working on my car in our detached garage. The way the home was sort of built is that you could see the detached garage from the window that's above the kitchen sink. I would glance out every now and then to see what he was up to. A little time passed, and I hadn't looked out at him for a bit. I started doing the dishes when I heard him walking into the living room towards the kitchen. I could feel his presence, and without turning my back, I said, "Hey, babe." But there was no answer. Wondering why he didn't answer, I looked back over my shoulder, only to be met with a dark silhouette of a man standing between the living room and the kitchen. In the blink of an eye, the figure was gone. Unsure of what I had just seen, I yelled through the window for my husband, who was still in the garage. He came in frantically, and I told him someone was in the house. Immediately, he went and grabbed his weapon and checked all over the house, but there was nothing there. In all of the years we lived in that house, too, not once did my husband see our roommate. I saw him all the time, out of the corner of my eye, peeking around the corners, but more than anything, I saw him looking into the living room from the staircase that led to the attic. In the beginning, he frightened me, but after a while, I don't know, I sort of got used to him being there. I even spoke to him sometimes, telling him that I'm okay if he stays in the attic, and asked him to leave my baby alone. He must have agreed, since in the 5 years my son lived there, he never saw him. When we went to sell our home, the realtor brought up some historical information though that she found regarding the house and our neighborhood too. And we found out that our house and our neighbor's house was built by a brother and sister. Our home was the brothers. Their last name was the same as our current neighbor, so I figured that he was most likely a descendant. And I asked him one day, and he told me that the sister was his mum and his uncle owned our home. He said that he was a kind man who lived alone and died in the home many years ago. I asked him about the attic, and he said that that was his uncle's favorite place in the home. He kept all of his trinkets and projects up there, and he would spend hours working on things. I didn't tell him that I believed my house was haunted, as he didn't seem like the type who would believe me, but our home was listed and sold within the same day. And sometimes I wonder about the man in the attic, if the new owners are nice to him or have even noticed his presence. I hope that they'll give him his space, as they're only passerbys in his home like we once were, I guess, but in any case, I know it's a somewhat good ending, but it was definitely a creepy experience, and I've never seen or heard anything like it since. It was only in this house that I saw the Shadow Man. This takes place about 7 years ago when I was 17. For context, I'm a pretty small and weak girl who only lives with my brother. My parents live in a different state. Also, please note too that I won't be using anyone's real name. So it was winter time, the last period before lunch break, and I was looking forward to going out with my friends, since my high school allows us to leave the campus for lunch. Me and my two girlfriends, we got together and walked to the nearby shopping plaza and looked around. I wasn't really hungry, so I just sort of was looking around to see if I recognized anyone from school around here. And that's when I saw a man in a black hoodie leaning on some old beaten-up pickup. I wasn't too surprised to see him, since this is public property, but I was a little confused that he was staring right at us. But that was when it clicked into my head that he sees us, 3 teenage girls looking lost. He's probably going to make a move on us, or maybe he's going to try and, kidnap us or something. Then, to my shock, he actually began to approach us. At this point, I was starting to have thoughts of being abducted and ending up becoming a missing person who probably is going to be found dead years later or something. I happen to think of the worst things when I get anxious. I know it's unrealistic, but I quickly turned to my friends and tried to throw out ideas of where to go, but I didn't want to show them that I was freaking out. And suddenly I heard my name. Sarah? Hey, Sarah. It's Dan. Your brother Josh asked me to find you. The voice sounds rather nice, but when I turned around, it was the same man. I felt like I was shot in the stomach because I stared at him for a few seconds before quickly breaking eye contact and looking around. Oh, who are you? I asked nervously. Well, I'm Dan, a longtime buddy of Josh. We actually went to that same high school together. So far, no lies were told. My brother did in fact go to this high school, and this guy did look about the same age as him. Hey, listen, your brother asked me to take you home. He mentioned something about meds. Somehow or another, he seemed to know the truth. You see, I sometimes have to take certain medication for my stomach issues, so far this Dan person was rather, honest, I thought. Or somehow knew stuff about me. Yeah, he said that he's piled in paperwork at the office and wants me to take you back to the office so you can stay with him till he's able to take you home. At this point, logically, I felt like this was a pretty trustworthy guy, but my gut was turning so much that I actually felt like I could be sick. I haven't noticed before, but my two friends decided to leave me. Jerks, right? I knew that I didn't really have much of a choice, I guess. I mean, I could tell him no, but what if he's telling the truth and my brother gets mad at me for not going with him? I know, I was young and stupid. And sure, I had a phone, but my brother turns his phone off at work. Or maybe if I tried to run and he grabs me, this might make a whole scene, which I honestly hate doing. So the only option that I really had, I thought so at that age, was just to go with him. So I took a light breath and accepted to just go with him. I got into the passenger seat and noticed that the car was kept rather clean, but the windows seemed almost like they were tinted from the inside. Dan turned his car on, which gave off a really nasty old car struggling sort of sound before turning on, and drove off. While on this ride, I kept my eyes down, not trying to look around or accidentally look at Dan again, but I did notice him eating some potato chips from a bag sitting on the center console. He would grab one at a time and go back for more frequently. But that's when he just grabbed my thigh out of nowhere and held it for a second. To make this worse, I was wearing some fairly short shorts because I can usually take the cold weather, so my upper thigh was visible while sitting. I stared at his hand for a second, feeling my head beating faster before he let go. Oh, shoot, I'm sorry. I often keep my chips on the passenger seat, he explained. But I didn't say anything. I just went back to staring at my phone, not even fake texting. I was too scared to look at him. After maybe 10 minutes of driving, I finally looked up, seeing an unfamiliar road before he pulled up onto a trailer park. I hope you don't mind. I just got to grab something before going to your bros. Come on inside. It gets really cold out here. No thank you. I'll be fine here. I actually need your help too, so come on in. He didn't look it, but his voice was almost demanding. I really didn't want to get on his bad side, so I agreed and quickly got out of the truck and followed. He led me to his trailer as I really didn't want to go in, and he started to take off his jacket. He then grabbed mine, which shocked me. It's okay, the Hester can get real hot in here. He then grabbed the sweater that I was wearing, but also my shirt under, and pulled up, forcing now all of my layers up. This pinned my arms up, blinding me, and I panicked and tried to struggle, but he held my shirt up. He said, "I see your tummy." I then felt as if I knew my innocence was about to be gone this day. But the weirdest thing happened. He poked my belly button and swirled his finger in it, which at first didn't hurt, but he kept pushing harder and harder, pushing my back to the cold wall and just kept going. It was horrible, and just having my belly button pushed in deeper and deeper like that, and it really hurt. I felt like I was about to be sick the amount of pressure that he was putting on it, but then suddenly he just stopped and released my shirt. As quickly as I could, I pulled my shirt and then sweater down, panicking as my heart was racing. He was laughing and patting the wall as if he had just heard the funniest joke. I felt sick, so I rushed out as fast as I could and coughed up just a few feet from his front door. Dan rushed out and tried to explain himself, but I jumped away as fast as I could. Breathlessly, I just said, I can't, or something like that. Maybe I'm sorry I can't, and I just begged as I fled the scene. I was thankfully able to run far enough to get to another neighborhood while I called one of my friends to pick me up after giving her the streets that I was on. And this whole situation felt like the entire day, but actually probably only lasted maybe like 20 minutes. I did speak to my brother about this, and he in fact did send Dan to get me. I never told him about what happened, and I fear my brother might take Dan's side if I did, but all that matters is that in the end I was okay and able to escape something that definitely could have gone a whole lot worse. So I'm an adult now, and this almost happened many years ago when I was around 11 to 13, I believe. This most likely happened in the year of 2013, if my memory serves me correct. My brother was the same age too, because we're twins, and my family was on a vacation at Galveston, Texas for a few days. This incident happened on the last day of our trip. We had fun at a pleasure pier which had plenty of rides, and afterwards we went to the beach for a few hours. Our parents decided that they wanted to go back to the car early, but we wanted to stay a little longer to collect seashells and swim and stuff like that. Once we got tired of the beach, we walked up the steps which led to the sidewalk where the cars were parked. My parents parked their car nearby, but it wasn't close enough to where they could see us walk up. Me and my brother knew exactly where to go though, so right when we reached the top of the stairs, two adult men started talking to us, saying something along the lines of, "Hey, we're having a big party, would you guys like to come?" They spoke vaguely about what the party would be like and that they had drinks there. They clearly tried to convince us to say yes though, and I instantly felt suspicious of them because they looked to be around their maybe mid-20s or early 30s. Why would they ask us when we were obviously kids and we just got back from the beach? I asked them when the party was, and they told me that it was later tonight. However, they said that it would be cool if we wanted to hang out with them now instead. I assumed that they meant by going in their car with them for a ride or something. I thought that their car could possibly be nearby. I told them that we can't because our parents are waiting for us. Thankfully, that made them back off, and they quickly just sort of ran away, and after that we never saw them again. As soon as we got in the car, I wanted to tell my parents about what happened, and they thought it was weird too. I'm glad that I was with my brother in that moment too, because I don't know how he would have reacted or what these guys would have said if he wasn't. I don't remember him saying anything to them in that moment, but in a way I feel like I protected him by speaking up and saying no as well. Now, I'm sure those guys watched us for some time, so they could make sure our parents weren't around before speaking to us. When we saw them, they faced towards the ocean, unlike other people who would just walk past us. I'm also curious if anyone else experienced a similar kind of, I want to say trafficking tactic, or perhaps heard about something like this from someone else. So, before I tell my story, you guys probably need to know some key information that will be shown in about 20 seconds. So I and my brother and girlfriend all play airsoft on the weekend, and I sleep naked. I was home alone as my mother was at her parents' house for the night, and so I was 14 at the time, and I was living in a weird and not so good neighborhood. But it wasn't too bad. I mean, it's not the type of people who would murder you or anything, but the type of people where you'd have to check everywhere locked twice to feel like you're safe. Luckily for me, when I came back from airsoft with my brother and girlfriend, I locked the doors and window, but I forgot that I had burnt something in the oven earlier and I had to keep one of the kitchen windows open. I live only with my mum and my German Shepherd, who is an actual monster. But at around 3 in the morning, I heard my dog bark viciously near my kitchen window, and what I've known over the years is that if my dog is barking that viciously, I knew something was up. So I put on some underwear and I got my gun off the wall and walked into the kitchen and turned on the light to find that there was a man wearing black clothes and night vision goggles on, and they were still on, blaring a green light glowing at the ceiling, and he was half in and half out of my kitchen window, wiggling like a worm. It's a tough window to get into, but the window was about eye level, and I cocked the gun back, ready to fire, and said, "Get out of my house." He stared at me, completely confounded, considering that he'd just been caught by a 14-year-old boy wearing just underwear and aiming a rifle towards him. He looked panicked, though, at the fact that the rifle was aimed straight at him, and he quickly rolled out of my window and ran into the nearby woods. I called the police and reported the guy with every detail that I saw on the man. A week later, a girl went missing. She was home alone and there was no sign of forced entry. The man had been caught for some really vile stuff just 2 streets away, and in his police interrogation, he confessed about stalking children by watching their houses at night. He used night vision goggles with green lights on it. You can probably imagine my shock. I would just like to remind people too to keep your eyes on the lookout for people like this and always keep every door and window closed and locked. Not what I did. So me and my best friend or roommate have been living together about 3 years now. This is kind of important too because we're so familiar with each other at this point. We have a beautiful historic home in the city, but with the rent skyrocketing and 4 dogs to clean up after, spending $2,000 a month for a massive 8-bedroom home is just simply not worth the cost anymore. So we decided to downsize and stop renting. But we're moving into a new house that is in need of a lot of TLC to make it livable. But it was a great deal and will save me hours of my time in cleaning and costs $3,000 less a month in bills for both of us. It's really such a good opportunity, but unfortunately the house, while new and quite nice, has been through a rat infestation and was kind of a hoard site. You see, the prior resident kept her stuff at the house but had mostly abandoned it and hadn't even slept there in about maybe 4 years. She chain smoked inside every day when she was there, and I don't know that it was ever cleaned or anything too, so we're definitely in the thick of it right now, getting it back into shape. Clearing furniture and tidying, repainting and power washing. Outside of changing light fixtures and appliances, repairing flooring and stuff like that, we aren't doing a lot of major construction. Just sort of, sanitizing, I guess you could say, and redecorating, basically. We know the prior residents well, though, as we bought the house from his family, and it definitely seems like the house got how it was due to undiagnosed depression. Well, currently my roommate is visiting this long-distance boyfriend in NOLA, and I've been focusing on clearing out and repainting the sunroom, and I'm almost exclusively there at night, but a couple of nights ago I was doing that with the backsliding door open to the backyard, and I heard my roommate's voice. Not any voice, but his voice. I could identify it too in my sleep. I mean, we're together so much. I couldn't tell what he said at all, but it was exactly his voice and sounded like a casual conversation, like he was talking to me from out of the yard. But I knew that he wasn't even in the state. Despite that, I really didn't feel scared or any bad vibes, I guess. I just sort of slid the door closed and kept working. Nothing else weird happened, and I moved on, but I kept thinking about it. Without bringing this up, I asked him if anything weird had happened to him in the house, and he told me that years ago, while staying there, he was sure that he saw a man in the backyard and called the police. We live in a high-crime city, so that's really not that unusual, but he said the police found no evidence of anyone on the property, and that sometimes when he stayed over there, he would hear weird sounds, but nothing that really alarmed him. That's when I told him that I heard this voice in the backyard, and now I guess we're just kind of curious. I literally feel no negativity, bad vibes, or danger on that property, but maybe I feel like I should. A close friend recommended that I place railroad spikes at the four corners of the property and iron nails above the exterior doors that lead into the home. I don't know if I believe in that or even what it's supposed to do exactly, but if anyone else has any advice, similar experiences, or ideas about what I should do about all this, I would love some additional input. Like I said, I definitely heard my roommate's voice, no doubt about it, and he wasn't even in the state. This happened several years ago when my daughter was about 8 years old at the time. I was about 29, male. I woke up early in the morning, 1 or 2 a.m. At first, I really didn't think much of it. I sort of peacefully woke up, kind of just looked at the ceiling for a minute, and then turned my head toward the bedroom door, and I could see the nightlight in my daughter's room slowly, softly changing from one color to the next. It lit up the hallway. The phases from one color to the next last only a few seconds. Yellow, blue, green, and then red. I always thought the red was a bit dark, a blood red. I watched it go through the cycle a couple of times. It turns red one last time. I don't think much of it until it just doesn't change. It stays red. I think to myself, that's strange, but I just wait thinking that eventually it will change again. But it doesn't. At this point, enough time had passed that I'm like, oh no, what's going on? So I decided to go and check it out. But it was at that point that I realized that I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. In fact, it seemed like the more I struggled, the harder it was to move. The panic started to creep in, and with every second that passed, the more panicked I became. Then, my daughter let out the most horrible scream, the kind of scream that you never want to hear from your own child. It was horrifying, and I knew something was terribly wrong, but the more I tried to move, the harder it became. I was freaking out. I didn't know what to do, but all of a sudden it went silent. Still, I'm struggling to get out of bed. A few seconds went by when another blood-curdling scream. Suddenly, though, I was released and I sprang out of bed, only to faceplant on the ground, because my legs didn't work. I couldn't feel my legs at all. But I had to save my daughter, so I butt sort of naked started to low crawl to my daughter's room, ready to kill whatever was causing her harm. She let out one last scream as I approached the door to her room, and I mustered all the strength that I could to stand up and flip the lights on. I screamed, What's going on? Are you okay?" And she was in the corner of her room, curled up, the look of pure fright on her face. She immediately runs to me and jumps into my arms, because whatever it was, it scared the heck out of her, and that scared the heck out of me. Once she calmed down, she told me that apparently she woke up and was just laying there watching her light change colors. Then it changed to red and stopped. She started to get scared and was going to come to my room, but then her bedroom door apparently turned into a large mouth with sharp teeth and started coming toward her, chomping up and down. Just before I got to her, I turned the light on, and allegedly that's what saved her. But how is this possible? I mean, I have sleep paralysis the exact same time my daughter had a night terror, and they seemingly were connected? I don't know. That seems way too coincidental for me. So my uncle's house was made from nothing, but the place where it had been abandoned for a long time before he started building. I have so many stories from that place, to me, that prove that it's indeed haunted, but I'll begin with the oldest one that I can remember, before there even was a house there. So right next to the house, there's a kindergarten there. I went there as a kid, just like my mum and her brothers before me. There was always a playground legend too about a man in a military uniform who called the kids to go behind the school and then they would disappear. Even as a kid, I remember being so afraid of going to that particular place behind the school, but as I grew, I stopped thinking about it. Fast forward a few years though, and my uncle's house had just been finished. One night, when I was out doing laundry with my cousin, I decided that I wanted to see the kindergarten from above, as it had been years since I'd seen it. So we go into the balcony and get a really good view of the place, and after a few seconds, I noticed somebody walking in between the classrooms in the back of the school. I couldn't see their face, but my whole body tensed as I saw the shadow go through the wall and then disappear behind the school. I remembered the story from my childhood at that moment, and still wonder if that is the same man the kids saw back then. Most of the paranormal experiences that I've had, they've been with said cousin that I mentioned earlier, so I do believe her when it comes to paranormal things that she's told me that happened in my uncle's house. And one of the scariest ones for her was a time when she had just come home from school and wanted to ask her aunt, Sarah, if they were going to be eating in her grandparents' house or if they would be staying there. So she goes to the bottom of the stairs and yells, "Aunt Sarah, are you there?" To which Sarah's voice responded, "Yes." Then my cousin yelled again, "Are we going to go to Grandma's?" But nobody answered after that. After a few minutes without a response, my cousin went to the second floor and started looking for Sarah. But there was absolutely nobody there. Not a single person. She then called her on the phone, only to find out that they had all gone to her grandparents' house and were waiting for her to go as well. Well, she ran out of there and didn't come back for weeks as she was too afraid of the voice that she heard. I wasn't present when this happened, obviously, but it's important to the next story because I was there for this one. So after that, and a bunch of other paranormal things happening to her and our family, they decided that they were going to call a priest to bless the house and invited everyone to pray and later hang out with them. My family was there, the 20 plus people in the backyard, as the priest blessed the house. We were all praying and singing, happy and united, when suddenly, just as the priest was going to climb the stairs to the second floor, a loud voice boomed down as if it was coming from where we were standing, and it said, "Go away." My 14-year-old self was shaking with fear instantly, but the lady that was directing the prayer yelled at us to pray louder and take each other's hands. A lot of people were crying with horror at what we had just witnessed, because it was definitely paranormal, and that has to be one of the scariest things that I've ever lived through. And because of that, I'm convinced that there is something horrible hiding in my uncle's house. When I was about 9 years old, this would have been in the early 90s, my family and I lived in a house with a fairly big wooded area behind our backyard. I say fairly big because, well, it wasn't big enough that you could really get lost in it for very long, but it was big enough that you could walk into it for a good 20 minutes before making it to the center. It got pretty thick in some areas too, and you couldn't see any of the houses from the neighborhoods once inside. To my friends and I, it was a magical world. We played in those woods all summer long. My mum would let us go in there as long as we were back by sundown too. Like I said, this was the early 90s, and times were a little different then. My best friend would come over, and we would just run out there and play for hours. We played hide and seek, army, Star Wars, and anything that we could think of. But our very favorite thing to do was to climb trees. We had a favorite tree to climb as well. It was a huge pine out towards the middle of the woods. The branches at the bottom were low enough that we could grab on and pull ourselves up, and the branches leading up were all very strong, and we could climb really high and see a view from above most of the other trees. Sometimes, too, when I got bored at home, I would go out there by myself. I'd climb real high in that tree and just think about stuff. I loved being way up there. It was really peaceful and calm. One Sunday, though, I decided to go out on a solo mission in the evening. I knew that I didn't have long before dark, so I hurried into the woods to get a good climb in. I was up in my spot in no time, and I remember it was late summer and the weather was still warm late in the evening. I wanted to be able to see a little bit of the sunset, I think, and then I would climb down and hurry home. I just sat up there and daydreamed as I waited for the sun to begin to set. But then I heard a twig snap on the ground, and I looked straight down and saw a man standing at the base of the tree looking up at me. I remember that he was wearing a filthy brown jacket and he had a patchy beard. His hair was sticking up at random places, looking like he had relentlessly run his fingers through it. And he was just sort of staring at me with a bizarre expression that seemed to be one of sort of wonder and delight. It was an extremely unnerving look, almost a look of someone that had just realized that they stumbled across the gold of the end of a rainbow. That's the only way that I can describe it, but instantly it made my blood run cold. I went completely numb, like I'd been injected into my veins. I don't know how long he had been watching me before I noticed him too, but thinking about that still makes me shiver. We just sort of stared at each other for a moment, I think. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. It sounds strange, I know, but I didn't want to scream or tell him to go away because I had this feeling that told me not to provoke him in any way. But after a few minutes, he spoke. "Are you coming down anytime soon?" I shook my head back and forth. I didn't know what to say to him. It was clear that I was very uncomfortable at this point, and that should have been enough to make any decent person go away, but he just grinned at me. Then he reached his hand up and grabbed the bottom branch of the tree, as if to test it to see if it could hold him. I do believe that he may have been planning to climb up to me, but the lowest branch was too flimsy and it just wasn't strong enough to hold a grown adult. And man, do I thank God for that. He soon realized this and gave up, but I had seen enough at this point. I finally broke my silence and started to yell for someone to help, and I just kept screaming and screaming. The man backed away a step or two from the tree and began to mumble and curse under his breath. He flailed his arms in the air in a rage and began making a motion like he was pushing an invisible person in front of him. And eventually he turned and just sort of walked away, stumbling with each step. I don't think anybody heard my cries too because, well, nobody ever came to help me. I stayed in that tree for what felt like hours because I just wasn't sure if he was really gone. I finally climbed down because the sun was beginning to set, and I couldn't bear to be out there at night. I hit the ground, and as soon as I did, I bolted back to my house, positive that he would pop out from a shadow and grab me at any moment. Thankfully, he never did. I made it home and told my parents what happened. My dad went out to look for him in the woods, but he never saw anybody. We stayed in that house for another 2 years, I think, before we moved across town to a bigger house, and I never played in those woods again for the rest of our time there. I still think about that man sometimes too. Like, what would he have done if I would have come down at that point? I have no idea truly, but that question, it does keep me up some nights. About 8 years ago, 2 buddies and I decided to spend the night camping at Palo Duro Canyon. We're from Amarillo, Texas, so it's less than like 20 miles away. This is the second largest canyon in the US next to the Grand Canyon. And while you may be wondering what kind of spooky stuff we may have run into as young kids of just 17 years of age, this isn't necessarily that kind of story. Instead, us 3 friends were some of the only around our age that we knew of that didn't indulge in partying. No drinking, getting stoned, nothing of that nature. So of course, we think a perfect getaway on a Friday night would be the canyon. But we didn't even own camping supplies, to be honest. We just went to Walmart and bought some and headed out on a whim. We make the drive and get to the state park at around 5 p.m. We enter the gate and set off to find a spot to pitch a few tents. We pull into this camping site area that has 2 separate canopies with picnic tables and respective grills for cooking. And in the middle of both canopies, a fire pit. Nobody was there too, so we thought that it was the perfect place to set up camp. We brought some coolers with soda, some hot dogs and hamburgers to grill, and a stereo to jam some tunes to, while we just sort of hung out and enjoyed the last few hours of the daylight in the Texas summer heat. After we pitched our tents, a truck with a small camper RV moseyed on into the site. A man and a woman got out and surveyed the area. The man saw us and waved, with that friendly Texan hospitality. We waved back, of course, and went on about our business. We ate dinner, and the sun was starting to set. I think it was around this time, too, that I noticed that the man and the woman didn't pitch a tent, and that they probably just intended on staying in their camper. We built a fire, sat around it with some portable chairs we brought, and I saw the man walking towards us. He introduced himself as Doug and said that he cooked a lot of extra food if we wanted any. We politely declined and told him that we'd already ate, but we appreciate the offer. He said, "Hey, as long as you guys have eaten, it's no big deal." He waved again and set back off to his camp. About an hour later, he comes back with a brown paper bag and he comments on the music that we're listening to, says how back in the 70s he went to all these festivals, and basically just sort of rambles on about how it's awesome that we're so young and still keeping classic rock alive and stuff like that. He notices then, too, that my friends have guitars and actually yells over to his wife to come on over. At this point, we really don't think anything weird of it. We just didn't know him or his wife, and he was obviously drinking and just invited themselves into our space, but none of us had the spine to say anything to him about it, so we all just sort of sat around the fire trading stories, as much as 3 17-year-old boys can with a couple of probably in their late 50s or early 60s maybe. After what seemed like a lifetime of, making up stories with these people we don't know, he starts trying to get to know us on a more personal level. Super polite, but obviously a little drunk. He asks us if we have jobs or if we're in school, and we'll reply. He says that he works at a United supermarket as a stocker and has for the last 15 years. Basically says that if any of us need a job at any time, that if we put him as a reference, he could get us on. He says his full name for us to reference just in case any one of us wants to apply. This is important later as well. And anyways, finally, the wife starts nodding off. All liquored and bundled up, she fell asleep on her chair. Luckily, that was the cue for Doug to get her back to camp and put her to bed. When they walk off back to their site, the 3 of us sort of look at each other and eye-rolled because we're all just sort of doormats and basically let this stranger come ruin our night. We see that it's close to midnight, so we decided to put out the fire and get ready for bed. Doug trots back over to our site. He asks us if we're here all weekend or not. We told him that we only had enough money to stay for the one night and that we'd be heading back to town in the morning. He said that he really enjoyed the company and that he'd personally pay for us to stay another night if we wanted to. We sort of politely declined this offer, and he started back off to his RV. He quickly turns back around though and says, "Remember guys, if any of you need a job, just call up to United Gem on Lake Road and tell them that Doug sent you." We smiled and said thanks, and he left for good that time. That night actually got considerably cold too, and in the end we decided to pack up and head back to our warm beds in town at around 4 a.m. As we were leaving the canyon, we almost hit a deer and veered off the road. Everyone was okay, but we were definitely shocked because it was so late and we'd basically gotten no sleep at that point. And us almost hitting the deer was practically the climax of our trip to the canyon that weekend, and we all continued back to school on Monday like normal. Now, one of my friends that was with me on the camping trip was actually in my 3rd period class on Monday. And we started talking about how that guy Doug and his wife were pretty cool despite not taking the hint that we didn't care to hang out with them. At some point, I asked my buddy if he could remember Doug's last name, and somehow he did, so for some reason I just Googled him. And that was a huge mistake. Because guess who was a 10 times over registered sex offender, and you can probably guess the ages of his victims. Yeah, it was him, Doug. This rocked our world completely. We had somehow, some way, just barely escaped the clutches of this monster. And what would have happened to us if we had taken his offer to stay another night? I was so suspicious of this dude as well, and just couldn't get the scenario off my mind that I decided to call the United supermarket to tell the manager that one of his employees was being really creepy to us kids, and that he might want to be wary of the people that he hires. And guess what? Nobody by Doug's name has ever worked for the United. He had completely pulled the wool over all of our eyes all night long, trying to get us drunk to do God knows what to us innocent kids. I guess the lesson for us that night was be careful of who you talk to. Before I get into this story, I just want to preface by saying that I 100% believe in the paranormal and think that it's definitely what's going on here. My only question is, why is it happening? I'm only 20 years old. I still live at home. My family built this house 15 years ago, the first and only family to live in it, so nobody has died within the physical house ever. We live in the Midwest, so that may say something about the land that the house is built on, but I just honestly couldn't say. But pretty much ever since I was a kid and we moved into this house, I've experienced strange occurrences that I can only attribute to being paranormal. My older brother recalls a couple of experiences of his own too, but we're the only two in the house that seriously believe that they are paranormal occurrences. The earliest that I can remember was in the late 2000s, waking up in the middle of the night seeing what looked like Aztec warriors doing some sort of a dance at the end of my bed. I wouldn't say it was sleep paralysis though, because I could sit up and move my arms and legs, and this went on for about 15 to 20 seconds before I blinked and everything stopped. When I moved into another room on the ground floor, there were multiple times that I would wake up in the middle of the night to hear harmonica music coming from the living room. On one occasion, when I heard the music and I went down to see what it was, I found every light in the house was turned on. On this occasion, my brother also remembers waking up face down on the floor in his room in a sort of plank position with the lights on, with no memory of getting down there. My latest encounter, though, I was working on our computer in the downstairs living room. I was home alone at the time, the rest of the family was out of town, when I heard the door to our stairs to go upstairs shut. It startled me, obviously, knowing that I'm supposed to be alone, so I called out who did that. After a couple of seconds, a weird, airy voice that sounded like it was coming from all around me all of a sudden said, "I did." That was the first time that I had actually had any two-way contact with whatever it was messing around in the house, and being alone that night, I went and stayed at a friend's house. A little while ago, though, I got a call from my brother who was alone at the house saying that he was laying in bed in his room watching TV with the door just barely cracked open. He said that he heard tapping on the door and apparently turned to see fingers tapping on the inside of the door, as if someone was hiding on the other side grabbing the side of the door with their hand. When he got up to open the door to see who was doing it, the hand disappeared back outside of his room and he couldn't find anyone or anything in the house. Other small things happen pretty often too, like keys or wallets that you know were sitting on the end of the table suddenly go missing for about half an hour, then suddenly reappear exactly where you left them. We are honestly at a loss at this point. Usually with stuff like this, there's a bit of a pattern to the behavior, where it happens, what happens, but what we have witnessed just seems like the most random junk for absolutely no reason. Do any of you guys have any ideas about what all of this could be? So this is a little story from when I was growing up in northern Kentucky in the 90s. I would have been around 10, I think, maybe a little bit older, but I'm in my 30s now, and I vividly remember this happening, and I still think about it all the time. So my best friend lived with his grandparents for a bit on several acres of land in Walton, Kentucky, and I spent almost every weekend there. They never really did much with the land. It remained relatively cleared, but there were no farms or structures on it. They had a horse stable near the house, but that was it. And my friend, he'd received a go-kart for his birthday, so we were out driving it around on the open land. It was just the two of us, and we were having a blast riding this thing around. It was getting pretty close to dusk, and we knew that we were going to have to pack it in pretty soon. We came to a stop, and the engine cut out, and almost at the same time, both of us had this really strange feeling come over us. We just felt like we were being watched by something. It's weird how our lizard brains can still even process something like this, but we both agreed that there was just this weird overbearing feeling. We hadn't heard his grandpa's truck, and we were too far out to be seen from the house, so we started looking around. We were in an open field in the middle of their land, and it was surrounded by trees and tall brush, but something caught my eye first, and I got my friend to look in that direction. In the brush, we could see a long, almost black shape sitting very still. Now, I know at this point in the story, most of you are thinking Bigfoot. I can say that I just remember things being dead silent. Even now, I sometimes wonder if it was something else that we saw, but all I remember is thinking that it was a giant, and I mean huge, black wolf. I would guess that it was maybe 200 feet away from us, trying my best to remember. And it was sitting perfectly still, like not even moving an inch. But to me anyway, it looked sort of furry. I couldn't make out any other features like ears or eyes though, but I swear this was what was making us feel watched. It was like when you see a cat getting ready to pounce. That was what it felt like we were looking at. We were both getting really spooked by this point. The sun was going down behind the tree line now, and one of us was going to have to jump out and pull start the engine back up. We were whispering about it, what it was, what was watching us. Honestly, I forget which one of us jumped out to and started the cart back up, but when we looked back at where the black shape was, it was gone. The go-kart didn't have lights either, so we just drove as fast as we could back to his grandparents' house, and we told them what we saw. His grandpa said that we probably just saw a coyote or maybe a boar or something, but this shape, man, was long and low, and it was huge, and I don't know, a coyote just doesn't sit well in my head with what I saw. Not to mention, too, that it was like pitch black and furry, which was weird. Anyway, every few years I think about this story, and I've read that there are no wolves in Kentucky anymore anyway. I think that I've just convinced myself that it was a coyote or something, but the memory has stuck in my head all this time for some reason. Nothing else ever happened on his grandparents' land aside from a really bad car accident a few years later and some missing chickens. Again, coyotes would explain all that. And every once in a while, the horses would get really riled up at night, but we would go camping on his land and fishing a lot, and we had a lot of fun around there and never saw anything ever again. Anyway, this is my short little spooky story, and I wish it had a bit more to it, but it's 100% what happened. I found this place and thought that I would share this, and again, it may have been a run-in with a wolf, a coyote, a boar, or who knows, maybe Bigfoot. But whatever it was huge, and it scared the daylight out of us.